Solomon ibn Gabirol was an 11th-century Andalusian poet and Jewish philosopher with a Neo-Platonic bent. He published over 100 poems, as well as works of biblical exegesis, philosophy, ethics, and satire. One source credits Ibn Gabirol with creating a golem, possibly female, for household chores. In the 19th century it was discovered that medieval translators had Latinized Gabirol's name to Avesperon and had translated his work on Jewish Neo-Platonic philosophy into a Latin form that he had in the intervening centuries been highly regarded as a work of Islamic or Christian scholarship. As such, Ibn Gabirol is well known in the history of philosophy for the doctrine that all things, including soul and intellect, are composed of matter and form, and for his emphasis on divine will. Biography. Little is known of Gabirol's life, and some sources give contradictory information. Sources agree that he was born in Malaga, but are unclear whether in late 1021 or early 1022 CE. The year of his death is a matter of dispute, with conflicting accounts having him dying either before age 30 or by age 48. Gabirol lived a life of material comfort, never having to work to sustain himself, but he lived a difficult and loveless life, suffering ill health, misfortunes, fickle friendships, and powerful enemies. From his teenage years, he suffered from some disease, possibly lupus vulgaris, that would leave him embittered and in constant pain. He indicates in his poems that he considered himself short and ugly. Of his personality, Moses ibn Ezra wrote, "His irascible temperament dominated his intellect, nor could he rein the demon that was within himself. It came easily to him to lampoon the great with salvo upon salvo of mockery and sarcasm." He has been described summarily as a social misfit. Gabirol's writings indicate that his father was a prominent figure in Córdoba, but was forced to relocate to Malaga during a political crisis in 1013 CE. Gabirol's parents died while he was a child, leaving him an orphan with no siblings or close relatives. He was befriended, supported and protected by a prominent political figure of the time, Yaqutl ibn Hassan al-Mutawakkil ibn Qabran, and moved to Zaragoza, then an important center of Jewish culture. Gabirol's antisocial temperament, occasionally boastful poetry, and sharp wit earned him powerful enemies, but as long as Yaqutl lived, Gabirol remained safe from them and he was able to freely immerse himself in study of the Talmud, grammar, geometry, astronomy, and philosophy. However, when Gabirol was 17 years old, his benefactor was assassinated as the result of a political conspiracy, and by 1045 Gabirol found himself compelled to leave Saragossa. He was then sponsored by no less than the Grand Vizier and top general to the kings of Granada, Samuel ibn Nagrala. Gabirol made Shmuel Hanajid an object of praise in his poetry until an estrangement arose between them and he became the butt of Gabirol's bitterest irony. It seems Gabirol never married, and that he spent the remainder of his life wandering. Gabirol had become an accomplished poet and philosopher at an early age. By age 17, he had composed 5 of his known poems, one an Azara enumerating all 613 commandments of Judaism. At age 17, he composed a 200-verse elegy for his friend Yaqutl, and 4 other notable elegies to mourn the death of Higgaon. By age 19, he had composed a 400-verse alphabetical and acrostic poem teaching the rules of Hebrew grammar. By age 23 or 25, he had composed in Arabic Improvement of the Moral Qualities, Arabic, translated into Hebrew by Judah ben Saul ibn Tibbon as Hebrew. At around age 25 or not, he may have composed composed his collection of proverbs Mivshaninum, although scholars are divided on his authorship. At around age 28, or not, he composed his philosophical work Fons Vitae. Is mentioned above. The conflicting accounts of Gabirol's death have him dying either before age 30 or by age 48. The opinion of earliest death, that he died before age 30, is believed to be based upon a misreading of medieval sources. The remaining two opinions of that he died either in 1069 or 1070, or around 1058 in Valencia. As to the circumstances of his death, one legend claims that he was trampled to death by an Arab horseman. A second legend relates that he was murdered by a Muslim poet who was jealous of Gabirol's poetic gifts, and who secretly buried him beneath the roots of a fig tree. The tree bore fruit in abundant quantity and of extraordinary sweetness. Its uniqueness excited attention and provoked an investigation. The resulting inspection of the tree uncovered Gabirol's remains, and led to the identification and execution of the murderer. Historical identity. Though Gabirol's legacy was esteemed throughout the Middle Ages and Renaissance periods, it was historically minimized by two eras of scholarship that misattributed his works. False ascription as King Solomon. Gabirol seems to have often been called the Malagan, after his place of birth, and would occasionally so refer to himself when encrypting his signature in his poems, while in modern Hebrew it is also called Malaga, that is in deference to its current Spanish pronunciation. In Gabirol's day, when the city was ruled by Arabic speakers, it was called Malacca, as it is to this day by Arabic speakers. The 12th century Arab philosopher Jabir ibn Afla misinterpreted manuscript signatures of the form to mean Solomon, the Jew, the king, and so ascribed to Solomon some 17 philosophical essays of Gabirol. The 15th century Jewish philosopher Yohanan el-Mano imported that error back into the Hebrew canon, and added another 4 works to the list of false ascriptions. Identification as a Vespron. In 1846, Solomon Monk discovered among the Hebrew manuscripts in the French National Library in Paris a work by Shem Tov ibn Falakwa, comparing it with a Latin work by a Vespron entitled Fons Vitae. Monk proved them to both excerpt an Arabic original of which the Fons Vitae was evidently the translation. Monk concluded that Vespron or Avensprol, who had for centuries been believed to be an Christian or Arabic Muslim philosopher, was instead identical with the Jewish Solomon ibn Gabirol. The centuries-long confusion was in part due to a content feature atypical in Jewish writings. Fons Vitae exhibits an independence of Jewish religious dogma, and does not cite biblical verses or rabbinic sources. The progression in the Latinization of Gabirol's name seems to have been Ibn Gabirol, Ibn Jbirol, Avenjbirol, Evenjbrol, Avensbrol, Avisbrol, and finally Avispron. Some sources still refer to him as Avisembron, Avisembrol, or Avensbrol. Philosophy. Gabirol, in his poem, claims to have written 20 philosophical works. Through scholarly deduction, we know the titles, but we only have the texts of 2. Gabirol made his mark on the history of philosophy under his alias as Avisbron, one of the first teachers of Neo-Platonism in Europe, and author of Fons Vitae. As such, he is best known for the doctrine that all things, including soul and intellect, are composed of matter and form, and for his emphasis on divine will. His role has been compared to that of Philo. Both were ignored by the fellow Jews, but exercised considerable influence upon Gentiles, and both served as cultural intermediaries. Fons Vitae. Fons Vitae is a Neo-Platonic philosophical dialogue between master and disciple on the nature of creation and how understanding what we can help us know how to live. His goal is to understand the nature of being and human beings so that he might better understand and better inspire the pursuit of knowledge and the doing of good deeds. The work stands out in the history of philosophy for introducing the doctrine that all things, including soul and intellect, are composed of matter and form, and for its emphasis on divine will. Student, what is the purpose of man? Teacher, the inclination of his soul to the higher world in order that everyone might return to his light. In the closing sentences of the Fons Vitae, Ibn Gabirol further describes this state of return as a liberation from death and a cleaving to the source of life. The work was originally composed in Arabic, of which no copies are extant. It was preserved for the ages by a translation into Latin in the year 1150 by Abraham ibn Daud and Dominicus Gundisalinus, who was the first official director of the Toledo School of Translators, a scholastic philosopher, and the Archdeacon of Segovia, Spain. In the 13th century, Shem Tov ibn Falakari wrote a summary of Fons Vitae in Hebrew, and only in 1926 was the full Latin text was translated into Hebrew. Fons Vitae consists of 5 sections: matter and form in general and the relation in physical substances, the substance which underlies the corporeality of the world, proofs of the existence of intermediaries between God and the physical world, proofs that these intelligibles are likewise constituted of matter and form, universal matter and universal form. Fons Vitae posits that the basis of existence and the source of life in every created thing is a combination of matter and form. The doctrine of matter and form informed the work's subtitle, De Materia et Forma. Quote, its chief doctrines are: everything that exists may be reduced to 3 categories: God, matter and form, will. All created beings are constituted of form and matter. This holds true for both the physical world and the spiritual world, which latter are the connecting link between the first substance and the physical world. Matter and form are always and everywhere in the relation of sustenance and sustentatum, propriatum and proprietors, substratum and property or attribute. Influence within Judaism. Though Gabirol, as a philosopher, was ignored by the Jewish community, Gabirol, as a poet, was not, and through his poetry, introduced his philosophical ideas. His best-known poem, Keta Malkit, is a philosophical treatise in poetical form, the double of the Fons Vitae. For example, the 83rd line of the poem points to one of the teachings of the Fons Vitae, viz., that all the attributes predicated of God exist apart in thought alone and not in reality. Moses ibn Ezra is the first to mention Gabirol as a philosopher, praising his intellectual achievements, and quoting several passages from the Fons Vitae in his own work, Aragat ha-Bossam. Abraham ibn Ezra, who cites Gabirol's philosophico-allegorical Bible interpretation, borrows from the Fons Vitae both in his prose and in his poetry without giving due credit. The 12th century philosopher Joseph ibn Zadig borrows very largely from the Fons Vitae at every point of his work. Microcosmos. The 12th century philosopher Abraham ibn Daud of Toledo was the first to take exception to Gabirol's teachings. In Sefer HaKabbalah he refers to Gabirol as a poet in complimentary phrase. But in order to counteract the influence of Ibn Gabirol the philosopher, he wrote an Arabic book, translated into Hebrew under the title Emunah Ramah, in which he reproaches Gabirol with having philosophized without any regard to the requirements of the Jewish religious position, and bitterly accuses him of mistaking a number of poor reasons for one good one. He criticizes Gabirol for being repetitive, wrong-headed and unconvincing. Occasional traces of Ibn Gabirol's thought are found in some of the Kabbalistic literature writer of the 13th century. Later references to Ibn Gabirol, such as those of Elijah Chabio, Isaac Abarbanel, Judah Abarbanel, Moses al-Moznino, and Joseph Solomon del Medigo, are based upon an acquaintance with the scholastic philosophy, especially the works of Aquinas. The 13th century Jewish philosopher Barichi Ahanekad drew upon Gabirol's works in his encyclopedic philosophical text Sefer HaHibur. Influence on scholasticism. For over 6 centuries, the Christian world regarded Fons Vitae as the work of a Christian philosopher or Arabic Muslim philosopher, and it became a cornerstone and bone of contention in many theologically charged debates between Franciscans and Dominicans. The Aristotelian Dominicans, led by St. Albertus Magnus and St. Thomas Aquinas, opposed the teachings of Fons Vitae. The Platonist Franciscans, led by Duns Scotus, supported its teachings, and led to its acceptance in Christian philosophy, influencing later philosophers such as the 16th-century Dominican friar Giordano Bruno. Other early supporters of Gabirol's philosophy include Dominicus Gundisalinus, who translated the Fons Vitae into Latin and incorporated its ideas into his own teaching. William of Auvergne refers to the work of Gabirol under the title Fons Sapientiae. Quote, he speaks of Gabirol as a Christian, and praises him as unicus omnium philosophantium nobilissimus. Quote, Alexander of Hales and his disciple Bonaventura accept the teaching of Gabirol that spiritual substances consist of matter and form. William of Lamart. The main points at issue between Gabirol and Aquinas were the universality of matter, Aquinas holding that spiritual substances are immaterial, the plurality of forms in a physical entity, which Aquinas denied, the power of activity of physical beings, which Gabirol affirmed. Aquinas held that Gabirol made the mistake of transferring to real existence the theoretical combination of genus and species, and that he thus came to the erroneous conclusion that in reality all things are constituted of matter and form as genus and species respectively. Ethics. The improvement of the moral qualities. The improvement of the moral qualities is an ethical treatise which has been called by Monk a popular manual of morals. Quote, it was composed by Gabirol at Saragossa in 1045, at the request of some friends who wished to possess a book treating of the qualities of man and the methods of effecting their improvement. The innovations in the work are that it presents the principles of ethics independently of religious dogma, and that it proposes that the 5 physical senses are emblems and instruments of virtue and vice, but not their agents. Thus, a person's inclination to vice is subject to a person's will to change. Gabirol presents a tabular diagram of the relationship of 20 qualities to the 5 senses, reconstructed aright, and urges his readers to train the qualities of the souls into good through self-understanding and habituation. He regards man's ability to do so as an example of divine benevolence. While this work of Gabirol is not widely studied in Judaism, it has many points in common with Bahya ibn Pakuda's very popular work Chova Halavevit, written in 1040, also in Saragossa. Mivshahapaninam, an ethical work of 64 chapters, has been attributed to Gabirol since the 19th century, but this is doubtful. It was originally published, along with a short commentary, in Soncino, Italy, in 1484, and has since been reworked and republished in many forms and abridged editions. The work is a collection of maxims, proverbs, and moral reflections, many of them of Arabic origin, and bears a strong similarity to the Florilegium of Hunayn ibn Ishaq and other Arabic and Hebrew collections of ethical sayings, which were highly prized by both Arabs and Jews. Poetry. Gabirol wrote both sacred and secular poems in Hebrew, and was recognized even by his critics as the greatest poet of his age. His secular poems express disillusionment with social mores and worldliness, but are written with a sophistication and artistry that reveals him to have been socially influenced by his worldly Arabic contemporaries. Gabirol's lasting poetic legacy, however, was his sacred works. Today, his religious lyrics are considered by many to be the most powerful of the kind in the medieval Hebrew tradition, and his long cosmological masterpiece, Malchat, is acknowledged today as one of the greatest poems in all of Hebrew literature. His verses are distinctive for tackling complex metaphysical concepts, expressing scathing satire, and declaring his religious devotion unabashedly. Gabirol wrote with a pure biblical Hebrew diction that would become the signature style of the Spanish school of Hebrew poets, and he popularized in Hebrew poetry the strict Arabic meter introduced by Dunash ben Labrit. Abraham ibn Ezra calls Gabirol, not ben Labrit, the writer of metric songs, and in Sefer Ahot uses Gabirol's poems to illustrate various poetic meters. He wrote also more than 100 piyutim and selacho for the Sabbath, festivals, and fast days, most of which have been included in the holy day prayer books of Sephardim, Ashkenazim, and even Karaites. Some of his most famous in liturgical use are Izarot, Shir HaKovod, Shir HaChad, Malchad for recitation on Yom Kippur, various dirges mourning the destruction of the Temple in Jerusalem and the plight of Israel. Gabirol's most famous poem is Malchat, which, in 900 lines, describes the cosmos as testifying to its own creation by God, based upon the then current scientific understanding of the cosmos.